Hey guys, tonight we begin with the worst job interview in human history, becoming a doctor during the Black Death. Picture this. Your career counselor suggests medicine, and suddenly you're wearing a leather bird mask filled with herbs, poking plague victims with a stick, and wondering if your medical degree came from a Cracker Jack box. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together into the world where do no harm was more like try not to make things catastrophically worse. Let's start with the biggest misconception about medieval doctors during the Black Death. Most people imagine these physicians as brave, selfless healers courageously battling the plague with primitive but earnest medical knowledge. In reality, being a doctor during the 1340s was like being a mechanic who's never seen a car, armed with a rubber chicken and unshakable confidence in bloodletting. This wasn't some noble calling where dedicated healers worked tirelessly to save humanity. It was more like a medieval game show called Guess That Disease, where everyone loses and the prizes are horrible. Think of it like this. Imagine if tomorrow aliens invaded and everyone turned to computer programmers to solve the invasion. Except the programmers had never seen a computer and thought the solution involved balancing your humors and maybe some leeches. That's essentially what happened. When the plague hit Europe, the medical establishment, such as it was, had about as much understanding of disease transmission as a goldfish has of quantum physics. They were working with medical theories that made astrology look scientifically rigorous. These weren't the brilliant diagnosticians we see in medical dramas. These were guys who thought illness was caused by bad air, planetary alignments, and God's anger at people for enjoying themselves too much. When faced with a disease that killed roughly 1/3 of Europe's population, their response was basically, "Have you tried not being sick?" followed by some aggressive bloodletting and prayers. The 14th century was like living in a world designed by someone who really didn't like people. Medieval Europe wasn't the romanticized realm of noble knights and fair maidens that Hollywood loves. It was more like a survival horror game, where everyone had poor hygiene and really strong opinions about which saint to pray to for various ailments. Medical schools, if you could call them that, were controlled by the church and ancient Greek texts that were about as accurate as a weather forecast written on a napkin. Universities like those in Paris, Bologna, and Montpellier weren't churning out the next generation of medical pioneers. They were basically teaching students to recite Galen and Hippocrates like medieval parrots with diplomas. If you thought these institutions were centers of cutting-edge research and innovation, think again. They were more like very expensive clubs for rich men who wanted to feel important while fundamentally misunderstanding how the human body worked. The average medieval physician had studied for years, memorizing texts written by Greeks who thought the best way to understand anatomy was to avoid looking at actual bodies. Dissection was rare, often illegal, and when it did happen, it was performed to confirm what ancient texts said, rather than to discover anything new. It's like studying to be a chef by only reading cookbooks written by people who had never seen. Food. Cities were overcrowded, filthy, and perfect breeding grounds for disease. London, Paris, and Florence weren't the cultural centers we imagine. They were more like medieval petri dishes, where human waste flowed through the streets and bathing was considered either medically dangerous or morally suspect. The infrastructure was so primitive that calling it infrastructure is generous. It was more like a collection of buildings arranged in a way that maximizes the spread of disease. When the Black Death arrived in 1347, it hit a continent that was already weakened by famine, war, and general medieval misery. The population was malnourished, living in conditions that would make a modern health inspector weep. and completely unprepared for a pandemic. It was like hosting a dinner party where all your guests are already sick, your kitchen is on fire, and the main course is poison. Meet Guy de Chauliac, royal physician to Pope Clement VI and arguably the most famous doctor of the plague years. Guy was what you might call the medieval equivalent of a celebrity surgeon. Respected, well-educated, and absolutely convinced he knew what he was doing. Spoiler alert, he didn't. Guy had all the credentials a 14th century doctor could want. He'd studied at the best medical schools, written extensively on surgery, and had access to the finest medical libraries of his time. He was basically the Dr. House of the medieval world, except instead of solving mysterious ailments with brilliant deduction, he was solving them with mercury and horoscopes. But when the plague hit Avignon in 1348, Guy faced the medieval equivalent of performing surgery with kitchen utensils during an earthquake. His response to the crisis was, well, let's just say it wouldn't get past the modern medical ethics board. Guy recommended bloodletting, which was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. He prescribed theriac, a supposed miracle cure that was basically expensive snake oil mixed with ground-up unicorn horn. Okay, not actually unicorn horn, but equally mythical ingredients. Here's where it gets interesting. Guy actually survived the plague, which he attributed to his medical skills, rather than pure dumb luck. He wrote about fleeing Avignon at the height of the outbreak, basically abandoning his patients faster than passengers abandoning the Titanic. His survival strategy was less brave doctor fights disease, and more smart doctor runs away merry. Quickly, the contradictions are hilarious when you think about it. Here was a man who spent his career studying medicine, treating the most powerful people in Europe, and writing authoritative text on surgery. And when faced with the biggest medical crisis in human history, his best advice was essentially, try not to breathe the bad air and maybe consider relocating to somewhere with fewer dead people. But Guy wasn't stupid, just limited by the knowledge of his time. He actually made some surprisingly accurate observations about the plague's contagiousness, noting that it spread from person to person and that proximity to victims increased your risk. Unfortunately, he then ruined these insights by recommending treatments that would make a modern doctor prescribe therapy for the therapy. Modern medical professionals would look at Guy's methods like a master chef watching someone try to make gourmet soup by boiling shoes. His surgical techniques were actually quite advanced for the time, but his understanding of disease was stuck somewhere between magic is real and the stars control your liver. And if you think that's ridiculous, wait until you hear about the official medical response to the plague, which makes Guy look like Jonas Salk. This wasn't just about individual doctors making bad medical decisions, though there was plenty of that. The Black Death represented a complete breakdown of medieval society's faith in its experts and institutions. When your medical system is based on balancing imaginary fluids in your body, and your priests are dying faster than everyone else, people start to wonder if maybe the whole system needs a reboot. The consequences rippled through every aspect of society. Medical schools saw enrollment plummet because, surprisingly, people weren't eager to join a profession with a mortality rate that made gladiator fighting look safe. The church's authority crumbled as priests proved just as vulnerable to disease as everyone else, despite all their prayers and holy water. Economic systems collapsed as trade routes became highways of death, and entire guilds were wiped out. But perhaps most importantly, the plague forced people to confront the limitations of medieval knowledge in ways that couldn't be ignored or explained away. When your best doctors are recommending treatments that seem to make people die faster, and your holiest men are dropping like flies despite their direct line to God, it becomes hard to maintain faith in traditional authority. This crisis of confidence would eventually contribute to massive social changes. The Renaissance, the Reformation, and the beginnings of what we'd recognize as scientific medicine. The Black Death didn't just kill people. It killed ideas, institutions, and the medieval worldview itself. It was like a factory reset for European civilization. Except the reset button was covered in boils and everyone was screaming. But Guy de Chauliac and his fellow physicians were just the beginning of this medical nightmare. The real horror show was the day-to-day reality of trying to practice medicine, when your understanding of disease was roughly equivalent to a toddler's understanding of nuclear physics. Picture this. You're a newly minted doctor in 1348. You've spent years memorizing ancient text about balancing humors, and suddenly you're facing a disease that turns people's lymph nodes into golf balls and kills them in days. Your medical bag contains leeches, a rusty knife for bloodletting, and enough confidence to perform surgery despite never having seen the inside of a living human body. The treatments these doctors prescribed weren't just ineffective. They were often spectacularly counterproductive, like using a flamethrower to perform delicate surgery. And yet, these were the experts that desperate, dying people turned to for salvation. It was medieval medicine's greatest test, and spoiler alert, they failed it so completely that it would be funny if it weren't so tragic. Medieval medical theory during the Black Death was like a game of telephone that had been going on for over 1,000 years, where the original message was, the human body is complicated, and the final message was, mercury will fix everything. Also, your spleen controls your sense of humor. Unlike our modern understanding of medicine, which is based on things like evidence and not killing people accidentally, medieval medicine was built on a foundation of ancient Greek guesswork, religious doctrine, and the kind of wishful thinking that makes people believe they can cure cancer with positive thoughts and essential oils. The theoretical framework that medieval doctors used was called the theory of humors, which sounds sophisticated until you realize it was basically medieval doctors' way of saying, we have no idea what's wrong with you, so let's blame it on invisible fluids. According to this theory, the human body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An illness was caused by these getting out of balance. It was like believing your car problems were caused by having the wrong ratio of different colored jelly beans in your gas tank. This system had been handed down from ancient Greek physicians like Galen and Hippocrates, who were brilliant for their time, but had about as much understanding of actual human physiology as a medieval peasant had of quantum mechanics. The problem was that medieval doctors treated these ancient texts like holy scripture, meaning that questioning Galen was considered not just wrong, but potentially heretical. It was intellectual stagnation disguised as scholarship. And when the plague hit, this theoretical house of cards collapsed faster than a medieval castle made of actual cards. Take the case of bloodletting, medieval medicine's answer to literally everything. Got a fever? Let's drain some blood. Feeling depressed? Obviously you have too much blood. Broke your leg? Well, that blood needs to come out. Bloodletting was like the duct tape of medieval medicine. If it wasn't working, you just needed more of it. The theory was that illness was caused by having too much blood, or blood that was too hot, or blood that was just generally misbehaving. So naturally, the solution was to drain it out until the patient either got better or died, which medieval doctors considered a 50-50 success rate. They had special bowls marked with measurements, like they were following a recipe for human soup. Take 2 cups of blood and call me in the morning, was basically their medical motto. During the plague, bloodletting became even more popular, because doctors figured that if a little bloodletting was good, a lot must be better. Patients who were already weakened by disease were subjected to additional blood loss, which was like trying to help a drowning person by removing their life jacket. One chronicler described seeing plague victims so pale from bloodletting that they looked like ghosts before they even died. Another favorite medieval treatment was purging. basically medieval doctors' way of saying, let's make you vomit and have diarrhea simultaneously until you're either cured or too weak to complain. They had special concoctions designed to empty your digestive system faster than a Black Friday sale empties store shelves. The logic was that illness was caused by bad stuff in your body. So if they could get all the stuff out of your body, you'd be fine. It was like debugging a computer program by deleting all the code. One particularly enterprising doctor in Florence allegedly treated plague patients by having them drink a mixture of powdered unicorn horn, ground pearls, and gold flakes, which was basically the medieval equivalent of selling snake oil made from actual snakes. The cost of this miracle cure was roughly equivalent to buying a small house, and its effectiveness was roughly equivalent to throwing that money into a fire and hoping the smoke would cure you. Another popular treatment involved something called theriac, which was supposedly an antidote to all poisons and diseases. The recipe contained over 60 ingredients, including viper's flesh, opium, and various spices that were worth more than most people's annual income. Making theriac was like cooking a meal that required ingredients from 4 different continents and the tears of a virgin unicorn. The fact that it didn't work was apparently less important than the fact that it was really, really expensive. But it wasn't that simple, because nothing in medieval medicine ever was. While doctors were busy draining blood from plague victims, some physicians began to notice that this approach seemed to be making people worse rather than better. It was like watching someone try to fix a leaky roof by poking more holes in it and slowly realizing that maybe this wasn't the best strategy. Some doctors started experimenting with gentler treatments, but they couldn't abandon bloodletting entirely, because that would mean admitting that centuries of medical tradition were wrong. Instead, they tried to modify the technique, like using fewer leeches or smaller cuts. It was like trying to make skydiving safer by jumping from a slightly lower altitude. The contradictions became even more apparent when doctors noticed that their wealthiest patients, who could afford the most extensive and expensive treatments, often died faster than poor people who couldn't afford medical care at all. This was medieval medicine's version of a participation trophy. The more you participated, the worse your chances became. Meanwhile, some physicians began to observe that the plague seemed to spread from person to person, which contradicted the dominant theory that disease was caused by miasma or bad air. But instead of abandoning the miasma theory, doctors tried to combine it with their observations, creating explanations that were more complicated than a Rube Goldberg machine and about as effective. The result was a medical system caught between tradition and observation, like a GPS that keeps telling you to turn left while you can clearly see that the road goes right. Doctors knew their treatments weren't working, but they couldn't figure out why, and they couldn't abandon the theoretical framework that had defined their profession for centuries. It was intellectual gridlock at the worst possible time, like having a traffic jam during a zombie apocalypse. The result was a complete loss of faith in medical authority that would have made modern anti-vaxxers look like devoted followers of the medical establishment. People began to realize that paying a doctor was often equivalent to paying someone to kill you more efficiently, which understandably made them reluctant to seek medical care. Some patients started refusing treatment entirely, preferring to take their chances with the plague rather than with medieval medicine. Others turned to folk remedies, religious cures, and treatments that were probably just as ineffective, but at least didn't involve having their blood drained by someone who thought the liver controlled their personality. The medical profession's reputation plummeted faster than a medieval castle under siege. Doctors who had once been respected members of society found themselves viewed with suspicion and fear. Some were accused of deliberately spreading the plague for profit, which wasn't entirely unreasonable given that their treatment seemed designed to kill people. Universities saw medical school enrollment drop dramatically as potential students decided that maybe law or theology offered better career prospects and lower chances of accidentally murdering people. The few medical students who remained were often there because they couldn't get into any other program, which is exactly the kind of selection process you want for people who are going to be cutting into human bodies. Meanwhile, the church began to step into the medical void, offering spiritual remedies and prayer-based treatments that were probably no less effective than bloodletting and had the added advantage of being free. This led to turf wars between doctors and clergy that were like watching two groups of people argue about the best way to perform brain surgery using only spoons and good intentions. Meanwhile, as medical theory crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions, the practical reality of being a doctor during the plague was becoming even more nightmarish. The gap between what doctors claimed they could do and what they actually could do was becoming as wide as the gap between medieval people's understanding of hygiene and actual cleanliness. If medieval medical theory was like trying to perform surgery using a cookbook written by someone who had never seen food, then the day-to-day practice of plague medicine was like trying to follow that cookbook while the kitchen was on fire and all the ingredients had been replaced with random chemicals. The doctors who survived this period weren't necessarily the smartest or the most skilled. They were often just the ones who were fastest at running away from infected patients. And speaking of practical medical care during the plague, let's talk about what it was actually like to be a doctor when your patients kept dying despite your best efforts. And your best efforts involved techniques that would make a modern veterinarian refuse to treat goldfish. If medieval medical theory was a disaster wrapped in academic pretension, then the actual practice of medicine during the Black Death was like watching that disaster come to life and start charging people money. While university-trained physicians were busy debating how many humors could dance on the head of a pin, real doctors were facing the practical nightmare of treating a disease that killed faster than they could say insufficient bloodletting. The daily reality of medical practice during the plague wasn't the scholarly pursuit of healing that medical schools promised. It was more like being a customer service representative for death itself, except your manager was constantly screaming, and all your customers were literally dying while you tried to help them. Doctors found themselves dealing with symptoms they'd never seen, mortality rates that defied explanation, and the growing realization that their expensive education had prepared them about as well as a cooking class would prepare someone to perform rocket surgery. Context became everything during the plague years. A doctor's practice went from treating the occasional broken bone or fever to being essentially a medieval emergency room during a zombie apocalypse. The normal rhythm of medical practice, seeing patients, making diagnoses, prescribing treatments, and occasionally actually helping people, was replaced by a relentless parade of dying patients, who all had the same terrifying symptoms and who all seemed to get worse no matter what the doctor did. This shift from theoretical medicine to crisis medicine revealed just how unprepared medieval doctors were for actual medical emergencies. It was like asking someone who had studied theoretical physics their entire life to suddenly become a practical engineer during a nuclear meltdown. The gap between academic knowledge and practical application became a chasm that swallowed both doctors and patients alike. Consider the case of Master John of Burgundy, a physician practicing in Paris. During the height of the plague in 1348, John had all the credentials, university education, noble patronage, and an impressive collection of medical texts that he could quote extensively. What he didn't have was any idea how to deal with patients whose lymph nodes swelled to the size of apples, and who died within days of showing symptoms. John's typical day during the plague started before dawn and ended well after midnight. Not because he was dedicated to healing, but because people kept dying faster than he could process them. His waiting room looked like a medieval version of a disaster movie. patients with black boils covering their bodies, families weeping over loved ones who had been healthy just days before, and the constant smell of death and inadequate medieval sanitation. His treatment protocol was like following a recipe for disaster. First, he would examine the patient's urine by holding it up to the light, because medieval doctors believed that urine could reveal everything about a person's health. This was about as diagnostically useful as reading tea leaves, but it looked professional and gave doctors something to do while they tried to figure out what was actually wrong. Next came the bloodletting, because of course it did. John would make careful calculations based on the patient's age, the phase of the moon, and their astrological sign to determine exactly how much blood to drain. It was like having a precise formula for making things worse. He kept detailed records of his bloodletting procedures, noting how much blood he removed and the patient's response, which was usually got weaker and died anyway. The most tragic part of John's story was his growing realization that nothing he did seemed to help. His medical journal, which still exists, shows his increasing desperation as he tried treatment after treatment with no success. He experimented with different combinations of herbs, various bloodletting techniques, and even prayer, but the mortality rate among his patients remained stubbornly close to 100%. One particularly heartbreaking entry describes his treatment of a wealthy merchant's family. The father came to him with early plague symptoms, and John applied his standard treatments. When the father died, the mother brought the children, convinced that John's medical expertise could save them. John treated each child with the same careful attention to medical theory, and recorded their deaths with the methodical precision of someone documenting his own failure. By the end of 1348, John had treated over 200 plague patients. According to his own records, exactly 3 survived, and he wasn't entirely sure those 3 actually had the plague to begin with. His success rate was so low that flipping a coin would have been more effective than seeking his medical care. But John wasn't unique. His experience was repeated by doctors across Europe. Master Thomas of London kept similar records and reported even worse outcomes. Dr. Ibn Khatima in Granada documented treatments that seemed to accelerate death rather than prevent it. These weren't incompetent doctors. They were among the best educated medical professionals of their time, working with the most advanced knowledge available, and they were failing spectacularly. The psychological toll on these physicians was enormous. Many developed what we would now recognize as severe depression and anxiety. Some turned to alcohol, others to religious extremism, and a few simply abandoned medicine entirely. Dr. Geoffrey of Meaux famously burned his medical texts in his courtyard and became a monk, declaring that God was a better physician than any mortal man could hope to be. This wasn't isolated to a few unlucky doctors having bad weeks. The pattern of medical failure was repeated across Europe with depressing consistency. Whether you were in London, Paris, Florence, or Prague, the story was the same. Educated physicians applying established medical techniques and watching their patients die anyway. The pattern that emerged was like a medical version of Groundhog Day, except instead of reliving the same day, doctors were reliving the same failures over and over again. They would see a patient with plague symptoms, apply their standard treatments, watch the patient die, and then repeat the process with the next patient, somehow expecting different results. Why did this pattern exist? Because medieval medicine was built on a foundation of theory rather than observation. Doctors had been trained to follow established procedures, regardless of outcomes, which worked fine when treating minor ailments that often resolved on their own. But when faced with a genuinely deadly disease, this approach was like trying to stop a forest fire by reading poetry at it. The social and economic factors made everything worse. Wealthy patients expected expensive treatments, so doctors felt pressured to provide elaborate procedures, even when they suspected those procedures were useless. Poor patients couldn't afford medical care, which ironically probably improved their survival rates since they weren't subjected to harmful treatments. Politically, admitting that medical treatments weren't working would have undermined the entire system of authority that medieval society depended on. If doctors couldn't cure disease and priests couldn't prevent it through prayer, then what good were experts at all? It was easier to blame treatment failures on individual cases rather than acknowledge systematic problems. Compared to other medical crises in history, the Black Death was unique in how thoroughly it exposed the limitations of contemporary medical knowledge. Other epidemics had been localized or less severe, allowing medical authorities to maintain their credibility. But the plague was so widespread and so deadly that it became impossible to ignore the gap between medical theory and medical reality. The effects were catastrophic for both patients and doctors. Patients who might have survived with supportive care often died from the treatments designed to help them. It was like being in a car accident and then having the ambulance run you over while trying to save your life. Who benefited from this system? Primarily the suppliers of medical equipment and ingredients. Leech merchants made fortunes, as did sellers of expensive herbal remedies and exotic ingredients for theriac. The bloodletting industry boomed, which is a sentence that perfectly captures the absurdity of medieval medicine. Who suffered? Pretty much everyone else. Patients died from both disease and treatment. Families went bankrupt paying for medical care that didn't work. Doctors suffered psychological trauma from their repeated failures. Society lost faith in one of its most important institutions. The unintended consequences were perhaps the most important part of this story. The failure of medieval medicine during the plague led to increased interest in empirical observation and experimentation. Some doctors began to question established authorities and look for new approaches to understanding disease. It was the beginning of what would eventually become scientific medicine, though that development would take several more centuries. This period also saw the rise of alternative healing practices as people lost faith in trained physicians. Folk medicine, religious healing, and various forms of quackery flourished in the absence of effective medical care. Some of these alternatives were actually less harmful than conventional medicine, which says something about how bad conventional medicine had become. The long-term impact was a fundamental shift in how people thought about expertise and authority. The plague showed that having impressive credentials and ancient knowledge wasn't enough if your methods didn't actually work. This lesson would eventually contribute to the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, making the medical failures of the Black Death period an inadvertent catalyst for intellectual progress. Yet, even as traditional medicine was failing spectacularly, and doctors were becoming increasingly desperate in their attempts to treat the plague, a new and even more bizarre phenomenon was emerging. If regular doctors were having trouble, imagine how much worse things got when people started turning to alternative practitioners and do-it-yourself medical treatments. The collapse of confidence in university-trained physicians created a vacuum that was quickly filled by every charlatan, folk healer, and random person with a theory about disease who could convince desperate people to pay them. It was like the medical equivalent of a going-out-of-business sale, except instead of discounted merchandise, people were buying treatments that ranged from merely useless to actively lethal. And speaking of actively lethal, let's talk about the plague doctors themselves, those iconic figures in leather beaks who have become the symbol of medieval medicine. Because if you thought regular doctors during the plague were bad at their jobs, wait until you meet the specialists who were specifically hired to deal with plague victims. Their story is like watching a horror movie where the protagonists are both the heroes and the monsters, and everyone dies anyway. By 1348, The medical crisis had reached a breaking point that made the previous failures look like minor inconveniences. Regular doctors were either dead, had fled, or were so overwhelmed that they couldn't take new patients. Cities were facing the medieval equivalent of a healthcare system collapse, except instead of long wait times and insurance problems, people were dealing with doctors who had a success rate worse than doing nothing at. All into this nightmare stepped one of history's most bizarre and terrifying figures, the plague doctor. These weren't your regular physicians. These were specialists, specifically hired by cities to deal with plague victims when no one else would do the job. Think of them as the hazmat team of medieval medicine, except their hazmat suits were made of leather and looked like they belonged in a horror movie. About bird-human hybrids, the stakes involved in hiring plague doctors were enormous. Cities were literally dying, not metaphorically, but actually losing significant portions of their populations. Venice, Florence, Paris, and London were desperate enough to pay premium wages to anyone willing to treat plague victims, which should have been a red flag about the quality of people willing to take the job. Key players included city councils, trying to maintain some semblance of medical care, desperate families willing to pay anything for help, and the plague doctors themselves, a mixture of legitimate physicians, failed medical students, and people who thought putting on a scary costume and carrying a stick qualified them to practice medicine. It was like recruiting for a job where the primary qualification was willing to die horribly for money, and somehow people still applied. The most famous plague doctor incident occurred in Rome in 1348, when the city hired a man known only as Dr. Beak, which should tell you everything you need to know about medieval naming conventions and professional standards. Dr. Beak arrived in Rome wearing the full plague doctor regalia, a black leather robe that reached the ground, leather gloves that extended to his elbows, and the iconic beak-shaped mask that made him look like a cross between a medieval physician and a particularly ominous bird. The mask itself was a masterpiece of medieval engineering that solved a problem that didn't exist while creating several new problems. The beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs, spices, and perfumes because medieval doctors believed that plague was transmitted through bad smells. It was like wearing a gas mask designed by someone who thought the danger came from offensive odors rather than actual pathogens. Dr. Beak's first patient was a wealthy merchant named Giovanni who had developed the telltale buboes, swollen lymph nodes that looked like someone had stuffed golf balls under his skin. The examination process was like watching a bizarre medieval theater performance. Dr. Beak approached the patient while maintaining a distance of 6 feet, using a long wooden stick to poke and prod Giovanni while making observations through his ridiculous bird mask. "The humors are clearly imbalanced," Dr. Beak announced in a voice muffled by his leather beak, which made him sound like someone trying to give medical advice while underwater. His diagnosis was based on examining Giovanni's urine with his stick, checking the patient's pulse by holding the stick against his wrist, and consulting an astrological chart to determine the optimal time for treatment. The treatment itself was a comedy of errors that would have been hilarious if it weren't so deadly. Dr. Beak prescribed a combination of bloodletting, purging, and a special poultice made from crushed pearls and unicorn horn powder. The bloodletting was performed using his stick to operate a mechanical device from a safe distance, like playing a deadly medieval version of Operation Dawn. But here's where things got really interesting. Giovanni's family was wealthy enough to afford not just one plague doctor, but consultations with several. This led to a medical conference that played out like a scene from a surreal comedy. 3 plague doctors, all wearing their ridiculous bird costumes, stood around Giovanni's bedside, debating treatment options while maintaining social distancing and speaking through their muffled masks. Dr. Beak argued for aggressive bloodletting. Dr. Crow, yes, that was actually his name, recommended immediate amputation of the affected limbs. Dr. Raven suggested a combination of mercury treatments and prayers to Saint Sebastian. The debate continued for hours, with each doctor trying to outdiagnose the others, while Giovanni lay dying and probably wondering if this was some kind of elaborate fever dream. The climax came when the doctors decided to combine all their treatments. They performed bloodletting, administered mercury, applied multiple poultices, and began preparations for limb amputation. Giovanni, who might have survived with rest and supportive care, was subjected to every harmful treatment medieval medicine could devise, administered simultaneously by 3 men dressed like malevolent birds. The immediate aftermath was predictable. Giovanni died within hours of receiving treatment. But instead of recognizing that their interventions might have hastened his death, the plague doctors concluded that they hadn't applied their treatments aggressively enough. It was like watching someone try to fix a computer by hitting it with increasingly larger hammers and concluding that they needed an even bigger hammer. The story spread throughout Rome faster than the plague itself. People began to realize that seeking treatment from plague doctors was roughly equivalent to paying someone to kill you in the most expensive and elaborate way possible. Some families started hiding sick relatives rather than calling for medical help, which ironically probably improved survival rates. The response was immediate and varied, like watching a medieval society have a collective nervous breakdown. In real time, some people became even more desperate for medical care, reasoning that if plague doctors were this dramatic and expensive, they must be effective. It was the medieval equivalent of assuming that the most expensive restaurant must have the best food, even when everyone who eats there dies of food poisoning. Other families took the opposite approach and began actively avoiding medical care. Word spread through Rome's neighborhoods faster than gossip at a medieval market. Hiring a plague doctor was like paying premium prices for assisted suicide with extra steps. Some districts organized informal boycotts of medical services, which was probably the smartest public health decision anyone made during the entire plague period. The political fallout was immediate. City officials who had hired plague doctors found themselves facing angry crowds of citizens who wanted to know why their tax money was being used to fund what was essentially performance art with a body count. The Roman City Council held emergency meetings to discuss the plague doctor situation, which must have been surreal. Imagine a group of medieval bureaucrats trying to figure out how to fire someone whose job description was dressed like a terrifying bird and poke sick people with sticks. Meanwhile, the plague doctors themselves began to turn on each other. Professional rivalries that had been simmering beneath their ridiculous bird masks erupted into public disputes about proper plague treatment techniques. Dr. Beek published a treatise arguing that Dr. Crow's amputation methods were too conservative, while Dr. Raven wrote a scathing rebuttal claiming that both his colleagues were medical charlatans who couldn't properly balance humors if their lives depended on it. The ironic outcomes were the best part of this entire disaster. The areas of Rome that had rejected plague doctors and relied on folk remedies, prayer, or simply doing nothing actually had better survival rates than neighborhoods that had embraced professional medical care. It was like discovering that the cure for a headache was to stop hitting yourself in the head with a hammer. The church, seeing an opportunity, began promoting prayer and religious remedies as superior to medical treatment. Priests started offering spiritual diagnosis services, which involved less bloodletting and fewer bird costumes, but probably weren't any more effective. The competition between medical and religious authorities for plague patients was like watching two groups of people argue about the best way to perform brain surgery using only kitchen utensils and good intentions. Some plague doctors, faced with evidence that their methods weren't working, doubled down and became even more extreme in their treatments. Others quietly abandoned medicine and moved to different cities where their reputations hadn't preceded them. A few actually began to question whether their approach might be flawed, which was the first sign of intellectual progress anyone had shown since the plague began. This plague doctor incident wasn't just a case of medical malpractice with costumes. It was a perfect example of how institutions can become so invested in their own authority that they lose sight of their actual purpose. The plague doctors represented everything wrong with medieval medicine. They looked professional, charged premium prices, followed established procedures, and killed their patients with confidence and ceremony. What this revealed about medieval society was deeply troubling. People were so desperate for authority figures to provide solutions that they were willing to pay for treatments that obviously didn't work, administered by people wearing costumes that belonged in a nightmare. It was like hiring a therapist who insisted on conducting sessions while dressed as a demon and charging extra for the privilege. The long-term effects of the plague doctor phenomenon extended far beyond medicine. It demonstrated how professional credentials and impressive appearances could mask complete incompetence, a lesson that would eventually contribute to broader skepticism about traditional authorities. The image of plague doctors became a symbol of medical failure that persisted for centuries, reminding people that expertise without effectiveness is just expensive theater. Why historians still debate this period is obvious. It's a perfect case study in how societies respond to existential crises. Do people become more rational and evidence-based, or do they become more susceptible to elaborate scams disguised as professional services? The plague doctor phenomenon suggests that desperation makes people more likely to embrace solutions that look impressive rather than solutions that actually work, which is a pattern that might sound familiar to anyone who's observed modern responses to medical crises. Around the main drama of failing physicians and theatrical plague doctors, a whole cast of supporting characters played crucial roles in this medical disaster movie. These weren't the headline acts, but they were the people who kept the system running, sort of like how the crew of the Titanic kept working even as the ship was sinking, except with more bloodletting and fewer lifeboats. Master Aldrich, the barber surgeon, was the medieval equivalent of a discount medical provider. Part barber, part surgeon, and entirely unqualified for either job. While university-trained physicians charged premium prices to kill their patients with elaborate procedures, Aldrich offered budget death services from his shop next to the butcher's market. His surgical tools were basically sharp kitchen implements, and his understanding of anatomy came from cutting up the occasional pig. But here's the twisted part. His survival rates were actually better than the fancy doctors because his treatments were too crude to be as systematically harmful as university medicine. Aldrich's approach to plague treatment was refreshingly honest. He had no idea what he was doing, and he admitted it. When desperate families brought plague victims to his shop, he would shrug and say something like, "I can cut things off or drain blood, but mostly people die anyway." His honesty was so unusual in medieval medicine that people found it reassuring, compared to the confident incompetence of trained physicians. Then there was Sister Margaret the herbalist, who represented the medieval equivalent of alternative medicine. Margaret wasn't technically a doctor, but she had spent decades collecting folk remedies and herbal treatments that had been passed down through generations of women who couldn't afford real medical care. Her treatments included various teas, poultices made from plants she grew in her garden, and the radical concept of keeping patients comfortable while their bodies tried to heal themselves. Sister Margaret's approach was less aggressive intervention and more, "Let's try not to make things worse," which put her ahead of most trained physicians in terms of basic medical ethics. She would visit plague victims with soup, clean water, and herbal remedies that probably didn't cure anything but at least didn't actively harm patients. Her mortality rates were still terrible because the plague was just that deadly, but her patients died more comfortably and with their blood still inside their bodies. The most fascinating character was Rabbi Samuel the translator, who had spent his life translating ancient medical texts from Arabic and Hebrew into Latin. Samuel was one of the few people in Europe who had access to medical knowledge that went beyond the standard Greek sources that everyone else was using. He had translated works by Islamic physicians who had made significant advances in understanding disease and surgery. But here's the cruel irony. Samuel's superior medical knowledge made him even more frustrated with the situation than ignorant doctors were. He could see exactly how wrong the standard treatments were, but he couldn't convince his Christian colleagues to listen to medical advances that came from non-Christian sources. It was like having a modern medical textbook in a world where everyone insisted on treating disease with astrology and wishful thinking. Samuel actually wrote several treatises pointing out the flaws in standard plague treatments, but they were largely ignored because medieval academia had all the intellectual flexibility of a brick wall. These weren't isolated incidents occurring in separate bubbles. The stories of these characters interconnected in ways that made the medical disaster even more complex and frustrating. The web of relationships between different types of medical practitioners created a system that was somehow less effective than the sum of its already ineffective parts. Aldrich, the barber surgeon, actually worked closely with university-trained physicians, but not in the way you might expect. Wealthy families would hire expensive doctors for diagnosis and treatment planning, then send their patients to Aldrich for the actual procedures because trained physicians considered surgery beneath their dignity. It was like having a restaurant where the chef designs the meal but refuses to cook it, leaving the actual cooking to someone who learned by watching people prepare food through a window. This arrangement led to treatments that combined the worst of both worlds. Elaborate theoretical frameworks designed by people who had never touched a human body, executed by people who understood anatomy only in the vaguest sense. Patients would receive detailed treatment plans based on astrological charts and humor theory, then have those plans implemented by someone whose previous experience was mostly cutting hair and occasionally removing arrows from wounded soldiers. Sister Margaret often ended up treating patients after they had been helped by trained physicians. Families would hire expensive doctors, watch their relatives get worse from the treatments, then quietly bring them to Margaret in hopes that herbal remedies might reverse the damage. Margaret became expert at treating not just plague symptoms, but also the injuries caused by medical treatments, blood loss from excessive bloodletting, infections from unsterilized surgical procedures, and poisoning from mercury-based remedies. The relationship between Margaret and the male physicians was like watching a medieval version of professional rivalry. The doctors viewed her as an unqualified charlatan who was undermining their authority by actually helping people. Margaret viewed them as dangerous incompetents who were killing people for money. Both were probably right. Rabbi Samuel's translations created their own network of problems. Some physicians would secretly consult his work, then try to incorporate Islamic medical techniques into their practice without admitting where the knowledge came from. This led to treatments that were partially based on more advanced medical understanding, but filtered through medieval Christian prejudices and implemented by people who didn't fully understand what they were doing. The political networks made everything worse. City officials would hire university physicians for public health emergencies because they had impressive credentials, but then quietly employ people like Margaret and Aldrich to actually treat their own families. It was like having a public policy of using expensive but ineffective treatments for poor people while the wealthy secretly sought out cheaper alternatives that worked better. One particularly interconnected incident involved all four characters treating the same wealthy merchant family during a plague outbreak in 1349. The family hired Dr. Johannes, a university physician, for official treatment which involved bloodletting and mercury. When the patient got worse, they secretly brought in Aldrich for surgical intervention. When that failed, they turned to Margaret for herbal remedies. Meanwhile, Samuel was translating a text that described effective treatments for similar symptoms, but no one asked for his input because his knowledge came from Muslim sources. The result was a patient who received every type of medical care available in medieval Europe simultaneously, which was roughly equivalent to being treated by a modern emergency room, a witch doctor, a veterinarian, and someone who had stayed at a Holiday Inn Express all at the same time. Unsurprisingly, the patient died, but not before the family had spent enough money to buy a small farm. To understand why medical care during the Black Death was such a disaster, you have to understand the cultural context that made people think this was normal. Medieval society wasn't just medically ignorant. It was culturally structured in ways that made medical progress nearly impossible and actually rewarded incompetence as long as it came with the right credentials. Daily life in 14th century Europe was like living in a world designed by people who had never heard of germs, hygiene, or the concept that maybe things could be improved through observation and experimentation. People bathed rarely because they believed it was unhealthy, lived in conditions that would make a modern health inspector quit their job in horror, and thought that illness was caused by moral failings or planetary alignments rather than anything they could actually control. The belief systems of the time made medical disasters almost inevitable. People believed that earthly suffering was part of God's plan, which meant that effective medical treatment might actually be interfering with divine will. Doctors who failed to cure patients could always blame the failure on God's mysterious ways rather than examining whether their treatments might be counterproductive. Social structures meant that knowledge flowed from the top down rather than from observation and experience. University physicians were respected not because they got good results, but because they had studied ancient texts and could speak Latin. Folk healers, like Sister Margaret, who actually observed what worked and what didn't, were dismissed as ignorant peasants even when their results were better. What was considered normal versus exceptional reveals how twisted medieval priorities were. It was normal for a physician to charge enormous fees for treatments that killed patients, but exceptional for someone to suggest that maybe they should try different approaches when the current ones weren't working. It was normal to trust authority figures who had impressive credentials, but exceptional to trust evidence and observation. The social expectations around medical care were particularly bizarre. Wealthy families were expected to hire expensive physicians, even when cheaper alternatives worked better, because using budget medical care was seen as admitting you couldn't afford proper treatment. It was like being socially obligated to buy the most expensive poison instead of settling for discount poison that might actually be less harmful. These cultural factors created a medical system that was designed to preserve authority and maintain social hierarchies rather than to actually help sick people. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it exposed how thoroughly a society's cultural assumptions could prevent it from responding effectively to existential threats. Perhaps most ironic was how the medical crisis created a situation where the least qualified practitioners often had the best outcomes, not because they were more skilled, but because they were too incompetent to implement the most harmful treatments effectively. Aldrich, the barber surgeon's crude methods, were less systematically destructive than the sophisticated techniques taught at medical schools. The contradictions were everywhere and impossible to ignore. University physicians who had spent years studying medicine had worse success rates than herbalists who had learned their craft from their grandmothers. The most expensive treatments were often the most harmful, while free care from religious institutions was sometimes more effective than paid. Medical services. Medieval society created a system where expertise was measured by credentials rather than results, which meant that the people who were best at memorizing ancient texts were considered more qualified than people who actually observed what happened to their patients. It was like judging surgical skill based on how well someone could recite poetry, rather than whether their patients survived operations. The most absurd contradiction was that in a society that claimed to value human life and Christian charity, the medical system was structured in ways that systematically harmed the people it was supposed to help. Doctors took oaths to do no harm while practicing techniques that were essentially elaborate methods of accidentally killing people. Modern parallels to these contradictions are uncomfortably obvious. We still see systems where institutional authority is valued more than actual effectiveness, where expensive treatments are assumed to be better than simple ones, and where admitting that established practices don't work is seen as more dangerous than continuing to use those practices. The medieval medical response to the Black Death was a perfect example of how societies can become so invested in their own systems that they prioritize maintaining those systems over achieving the goals those systems were supposedly designed to serve. Everything changed when a Florentine physician named Giovanni da Prato did something revolutionary in 1349. He started keeping track of which patients actually lived or died after receiving different treatments. This might seem obvious to us, but in medieval medicine, it was like suggesting that maybe restaurants should pay attention to whether their customers survived dinner. Giovanni wasn't trying to revolutionize medicine. He was just frustrated that none of his expensive treatments seemed to work, and he wanted to figure out why. His approach was basically the medieval equivalent of creating a spreadsheet to track his failures, except instead of Excel, he used parchment, and instead of data analysis, he had growing existential dread about his chosen profession. The background to this change was pure desperation. By 1349, the plague had killed so many people that even the most stubborn medical authorities couldn't ignore the fact that their treatments weren't working. Cities were running out of both patients and doctors, which created a situation where traditional medical hierarchies started to break down. When everyone is dying at roughly the same rate regardless of treatment, it becomes harder to maintain that expensive treatments are superior to cheap ones. Key factors that led to this transformation included the simple fact that there weren't enough trained physicians left alive to maintain the old system. Medical schools had closed because professors kept dying. Students were reluctant to enter a profession with such high mortality rates, and the few surviving doctors were too traumatized to teach effectively. It was like trying to maintain a restaurant industry after all the chefs had been poisoned by their own cooking. This moment was different because Giovanni wasn't trying to reform medicine from within the established system. He was essentially creating a new system based on the radical idea that medical treatments should be judged by whether they actually help people. His innovation was less about specific techniques and more about the revolutionary concept that evidence should matter more than authority. The change unfolded like watching a medieval version of scientific revolution in slow motion, except instead of elegant theoretical breakthroughs, it was mostly people gradually realizing that everything they'd been taught was wrong, and that they'd been accidentally killing people for years. Giovanni's record-keeping started small. Just notes about which treatments seemed to correlate with patient survival. What he discovered was horrifying. Patients who received the most intensive medical care had the highest mortality rates. Bloodletting, mercury treatments, and surgical interventions all seemed to make outcomes worse rather than better. It was like discovering that the safety features on your car were actually designed to cause accidents. Resistance to these findings was immediate and fierce. The medical establishment responded to Giovanni's data the way a medieval Catholic church might respond to someone suggesting that maybe the earth goes around the sun, with accusations of heresy, professional ostracism, and threats of violence. Other physicians accused Giovanni of deliberately sabotaging patients to make traditional treatments look bad. which was probably the most paranoid conspiracy theory in medical history, thought the champions of change were an unlikely group. Some were physicians like Giovanni, who were driven by desperation to question established methods. Others were folk healers and herbalists who had never been part of the formal medical system and therefore had less invested in maintaining it. A few were clergy members who had observed that prayer seemed to work about as well as bloodletting and cost significantly less. Sister Catherine of Bologna became an unexpected leader in this movement when she started documenting survival rates at her convent's infirmary. Her records showed that patients who received only supportive care, clean water, rest, and basic nutrition had better outcomes than those treated by university physicians. This was particularly embarrassing for the medical establishment because it suggested that nuns with no medical training were more effective healers than people who had spent years studying ancient Greek texts. The specific steps of change happened gradually and often in secret. Physicians would quietly stop performing certain treatments while publicly defending them. Families would hire traditional doctors for appearance's sake, but secretly seek alternative care. Cities would officially employ university physicians, but actually rely on folk healers for practical medical needs. Obstacles were enormous and came from every direction. The church opposed changes that seemed to question divine will. University authorities fought to preserve their monopoly on medical knowledge. Wealthy families resisted admitting that they had been paying premium prices for inferior care. It was like trying to reform a system where everyone had a vested interest in maintaining dysfunction. Breakthrough moments were often personal tragedies that forced individuals to confront reality. One documented case involved a wealthy merchant who hired 3 different university physicians to treat his plague-stricken son, spending a fortune on elaborate treatments that clearly made the boy worse. In desperation, he turned to a local herbalist who provided simple, supportive care. The boy survived, and the merchant became a vocal critic of traditional medicine. The role of individuals versus larger historical forces created interesting tensions. While specific people like Giovanni and Sister Catherine were crucial in documenting the failures of traditional medicine, the broader crisis of the plague made change almost inevitable. When your entire medical system is failing spectacularly and publicly, someone is eventually going to suggest that maybe it's time to try something different. The most surprising aspect of this change process was how it happened despite institutional resistance rather than because of institutional reform. Medical schools didn't suddenly start teaching evidence-based medicine. They mostly closed or became irrelevant. The change happened in practice before it happened in theory, with individual practitioners quietly abandoning techniques that didn't work while officially maintaining their commitment to traditional approaches. The new medical reality that emerged from the plague years was less a coherent system than a collection of pragmatic approaches held together by the shared recognition that the old ways had failed catastrophically. Instead of a unified medical theory, practitioners developed what we might call defensive medicine, focusing primarily on not making patients worse rather than actively trying to cure them. This represented a fundamental shift from the confident interventionism of medieval medicine to something much more humble and observational. The new approach was less, we know exactly what's wrong and how to fix it, and more, let's try not to kill anyone while we figure out what we're doing. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a significant improvement over systematic bloodletting and mercury poisoning. Who won and who lost in this transformation was complicated. Traditional university physicians lost prestige and income, but those who adapted to the new reality often found more sustainable careers. Folk healers and herbalists gained respect and legitimacy, though they also faced new competition from reformed physicians. Patients generally benefited from less harmful treatments, though medical care remained largely ineffective against serious diseases. The new rules and norms that emerged were based more on observation than authority. Treatments were judged by outcomes rather than theoretical foundations. Simple approaches were preferred over complex ones. The patient's comfort became a legitimate medical goal, rather than something that interfered with proper treatment. It was like switching from a medical system designed by philosophers to one designed by people, who actually had to live with the consequences. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically revealed the deep conservatism of medieval institutions. The formal structure of medical education remained largely unchanged. Universities still taught from ancient texts and awarded degrees based on memorization rather than practical skill. But the actual practice of medicine was transformed, creating a gap between official medical doctrine and real-world medical care that would persist for centuries. The persistence of old forms alongside new practices created some absurd situations. Physicians would officially prescribe bloodletting while secretly advising patients to ignore the prescription. Medical texts continued to recommend mercury treatments while practitioners quietly stopped using them. It was like having a parallel medical system where everyone understood that the official guidelines were wrong, but no one was willing to officially change them. Was this change positive? From a modern perspective, absolutely. Moving away from actively harmful treatments toward more observational and supportive care represented genuine progress. The mortality rates from medical treatment dropped significantly, which was a low bar to clear, but still represented improvement. Different perspectives at the time were more mixed. Traditional physicians saw this as the collapse of legitimate medicine and the rise of dangerous quackery. Patients and families who had been bankrupted by expensive, ineffective treatments generally welcomed the change. Religious authorities were divided between those who saw it as rejecting God's plan and those who viewed it as returning to more charitable approaches to healing. Short-term effects were clearly positive. Fewer people died from their medical treatments. Medical care became more affordable, and the profession began to attract people who were actually interested in helping patients, rather than just memorizing ancient texts. Long-term effects were more complex, as this period of medical skepticism would eventually contribute to the development of scientific medicine, but it also led to centuries of medical uncertainty and the proliferation of various forms of quackery. Unintended consequences included the rise of medical nationalism, as different regions developed different approaches to healing that reflected local traditions rather than universal principles. This diversity was probably healthier than the previous uniformity of bad practices, but it also made it harder to develop systematic medical knowledge. Modern judgment versus contemporary views reveals interesting tensions. We celebrate this period as the beginning of evidence-based medicine, but contemporary observers saw it mainly as the collapse of established authority and the triumph of ignorance over learning. Both perspectives contain some truth. It was simultaneously medical progress and institutional failure, depending on whether you valued effectiveness or credentialed expertise. In the decades that followed the Black Death, the medical landscape looked like a post-apocalyptic wasteland, where survivors were slowly trying to rebuild civilization using whatever scraps of knowledge they could find. The old system of university-trained physicians following ancient Greek texts hadn't just been discredited. It had been so thoroughly demolished that most people couldn't imagine why anyone had ever thought it was a good idea. By the 1360s, a new generation of medical practitioners emerged who had learned their craft during the plague years rather than from traditional medical schools. These were people who had started as apprentices to barber surgeons, assistants to herbalists, or volunteers helping in plague hospitals. Their medical education was less memorize Galen and more try not to kill people while figuring out what actually works. The evolution of medical practice during this period was like watching someone try to rebuild a car using parts from a bicycle, a toaster, and whatever they could find in a junkyard. It wasn't elegant, but it often worked better than the original vehicle. Practitioners developed pragmatic approaches based on observation and trial and error rather than theoretical frameworks based on ancient authorities. New challenges emerged as the immediate crisis of the plague passed. Without the unifying threat of mass death, different regions began developing divergent medical traditions. Italian physicians started incorporating anatomical knowledge gained from increased dissection practices. French doctors began emphasizing surgical techniques. German practitioners focused on herbal remedies and chemical treatments. It was like watching medieval medicine fragment into different schools of thought, except this time the schools were based on what seemed to work rather than what ancient books said. The second-generation effects were profound. Children who grew up during the plague years had fundamentally different attitudes toward medical authority than their parents. They were more likely to question treatments, more willing to seek second opinions, and more skeptical of expensive procedures that promised miraculous cures. This generational shift created a patient population that was harder to impress with credentials and more focused on actual results. The medical vacuum left by the collapse of traditional medicine was filled by a fascinating collection of new players who would have been considered marginal figures before the plague but became central to post-pandemic healthcare. These weren't the old guard of university physicians trying to rebuild their former authority. These were innovators who saw opportunity in the ruins of the medical establishment. Margherita of Milan emerged as one of the most successful surgical practitioners in northern Italy, which was remarkable for several reasons. She was a woman. She had no formal medical training, and her patients actually survived their operations at rates that made university-trained surgeons look incompetent. Margherita had learned surgery by assisting her husband, a barber surgeon who died in the plague, and she continued his practice out of economic necessity. Her approach was revolutionary in its simplicity. She focused on keeping her instruments clean, her patients comfortable, and her procedures as brief as possible. What made Margherita different from earlier practitioners was her willingness to admit when she didn't know something and her systematic approach to learning from failures. She kept detailed records of her procedures, noting what worked and what didn't, and she adapted her techniques based on outcomes rather than tradition. Her success attracted patients from across northern Italy, including wealthy merchants who had previously would have hired only university physicians. Brother Thomas of Canterbury represented another type of new medical player, the empirical monk. Thomas had served in plague hospitals during the worst years of the pandemic and had observed that certain herbal remedies seemed to help patients while others were useless or harmful. After the plague, he established what was essentially the medieval equivalent of a clinical research program, systematically testing different herbal treatments and documenting their effects. Thomas's approach was revolutionary because he treated folk remedies as hypotheses to be tested rather than either accepting them uncritically or dismissing them entirely. He developed protocols for testing herbal treatments that were remarkably similar to modern clinical trial methods, control groups, standardized dosages, and careful observation of outcomes. His work represented the beginning of what would eventually become pharmaceutical research. The most disruptive new player was Master Ibn Rushd, a Jewish physician who had fled Spain during the plague years and settled in Provence. Ibn Rushd brought with him medical knowledge from Islamic sources that was far more advanced than anything available in medieval European universities. His surgical techniques, diagnostic methods, and understanding of anatomy were centuries ahead of European medicine. But Ibn Rushd's real contribution was methodological rather than technical. He introduced the concept of systematic observation and documentation that would eventually evolve into scientific medicine. He insisted that medical knowledge should be based on careful study of human anatomy rather than ancient texts, and he demonstrated surgical techniques that seemed almost magical to European physicians who had never seen proper anatomical dissection. These new players differed from earlier medical authorities in crucial ways. They were more focused on practical results than theoretical knowledge, more willing to learn from diverse sources, and more committed to adapting their methods based on evidence. They represented a fundamental shift from authority-based medicine to evidence-based practice, though it would take centuries for this shift to become complete. But some problems persisted with the stubborn tenacity of medieval bureaucracy. The fundamental issue of medical ignorance didn't disappear. Just because people became more skeptical of traditional treatments, it just became more honest about itself. Physicians still had no understanding of disease transmission, no concept of germs, and no effective treatments for most serious illnesses. The continuing challenges were like trying to build a modern healthcare system using medieval technology and Renaissance knowledge. Practitioners might have developed better observational skills and more humble attitudes toward their limitations, but they were still working with tools and concepts that made effective treatment nearly impossible. Surgery was still performed without anesthesia or antiseptics. Disease diagnosis was still largely guesswork, and most medications were still either useless or actively harmful. New versions of old problems emerged as medical practice became more diverse and less regulated. The collapse of traditional medical authority had eliminated some harmful standardized treatments, but it had also opened the door for every charlatan and quack in Europe to set up shop as a healer. The absence of credentialing systems meant that patients had no reliable way to distinguish between reformed physicians who were genuinely trying to help and confidence artists who were just looking for new ways to separate desperate people from their money. Some regions experienced what we might call medical anarchy, where so many different healing traditions competed for patients that medical care became completely fragmented. Italian cities might have Islamic-trained physicians, reformed university doctors, empirical monks, and traditional folk healers, all practicing simultaneously with no coordination or standardization. It was like having multiple incompatible operating systems running on the same computer, except the computer was human bodies and the crashes were fatal. Cyclical patterns emerged as different. Medical fads rose and fell based on temporary successes or charismatic practitioners. Mercury treatments would decline in popularity after killing enough people, only to resurface a generation later when practitioners convinced themselves that previous failures were due to improper application rather than fundamental toxicity. Bloodletting would be abandoned in one region while becoming more popular in another. It was like watching medical knowledge move in circles rather than progressing linearly. Why certain issues proved intractable becomes clear when you consider the institutional and technological limitations of the time. Without understanding of germ theory, physicians couldn't develop effective treatments for infectious diseases. Without anesthesia, surgery remained limited to procedures that could be completed while patients were conscious and screaming. Without scientific instruments, diagnosis remained largely based on guesswork and superstition. The most persistent problem was the tension between the demand for medical certainty and the reality of medical ignorance. Patients wanted doctors who could confidently diagnose their illnesses and provide effective treatments. But post-plague physicians were increasingly aware of how little they actually knew. This created a market for practitioners who were willing to fake confidence and promise miraculous cures, while honest physicians who admitted their limitations often struggled to attract patients. Compared to the pre-plague medical system, the post-1350 medical landscape represented both progress and regression. It was progress in the sense that treatments became less systematically harmful and more focused on patient outcomes rather than theoretical consistency. It was regression in that medical knowledge became more fragmented and less standardized, making it harder to accumulate systematic understanding of disease and treatment. Relative to other places and time periods, post-plague European medicine was remarkably similar to medical systems in other societies that had experienced major epidemics. The pattern of institutional collapse followed by pragmatic rebuilding seems to be a common response to medical crises that overwhelm existing healthcare systems. Chinese medicine had gone through similar transformations during earlier plague outbreaks, and Islamic medicine had evolved in response to various epidemic diseases. What was unique about the European experience was the extent to which the plague discredited not just specific medical treatments, but the entire concept of authority-based knowledge. Other societies had reformed their medical practices while maintaining respect for traditional learning. But post-plague Europe developed a more fundamental skepticism toward expertise that wasn't backed by observable results. What was universal was the human tendency to seek medical care, even when that care was ineffective or harmful, and the tendency for medical systems to prioritize institutional authority over actual effectiveness. Every society that has faced epidemic disease has struggled with the tension between the need for medical intervention and the limitations of available medical knowledge. The lessons that could be learned from this period were both obvious and subtle. The obvious lesson was that medical treatments should be judged by their outcomes rather than their theoretical foundations or the credentials of the people administering them. The subtle lesson was that reforming medical practice requires not just better knowledge, but also institutional changes that allow that knowledge to be implemented effectively. Patterns that repeated elsewhere included the rise of alternative healing practices during periods of medical crisis, the tendency for medical authority to become more decentralized after major institutional failures, and the emergence of more empirical approaches to healing among practitioners who had witnessed the failure of traditional methods. The most important comparative insight was that medical progress often happens not through gradual improvement within existing systems, but through crisis-driven collapse and reconstruction. The Black Death didn't improve medieval medicine. It destroyed it and forced people to build something new from the ruins. This pattern of creative destruction would repeat throughout medical history, suggesting that sometimes the best way to improve healthcare is to let bad systems fail completely rather than trying to reform them incrementally. By the early 1400s, signs pointed to the end of the chaotic post-plague medical period and the emergence of something that might eventually resemble organized healthcare again. But the warning signs weren't the triumphant return of traditional medicine. They were the gradual recognition that maybe having dozens of competing medical traditions in the same city was creating more problems than it solved. The key indicators were both practical and intellectual. Medical practitioners were starting to realize that complete medical anarchy wasn't sustainable when patients needed surgery or treatment for serious injuries. A barber surgeon who specialized in bloodletting might be perfectly adequate for routine procedures, but when someone needed complex surgery, the lack of standardized training and techniques became a serious problem. It was like having a transportation system where every driver had invented their own rules of the road. What key medical players could see versus what they missed reveals the limitations of even reformed medieval thinking. Progressive physicians recognized that some form of standardization and training was necessary to improve medical outcomes. They could see that empirical observation was more reliable than ancient authority, but they missed the fundamental importance of understanding disease mechanisms rather than just cataloging symptoms and treatments. Meanwhile, traditional university physicians were making their own calculations about how to regain relevance without admitting that their previous approaches had been catastrophically wrong. They began incorporating some of the empirical methods that had emerged during the plague years, while maintaining their claims to superior theoretical knowledge. It was like watching politicians try to adopt popular policies while pretending they had supported them all along. The resistance to inevitable change came from multiple directions and was often more about economics than medicine. Guild systems had been disrupted by the plague, and different groups of medical practitioners were competing to establish new monopolies over medical practice. Traditional physicians wanted to restore their exclusive rights to practice medicine. Barber surgeons wanted recognition as legitimate medical practitioners. Herbalists and folk healers wanted protection from prosecution for practicing without licenses. But perhaps the most significant sign of change was generational. People who had grown up during the plague years and had seen both the failure of traditional medicine and the success of more pragmatic approaches were reaching positions of authority in cities and universities. These weren't people who had nostalgic attachments to the old system. They were people who had witnessed its collapse and were interested in building something better. The medieval medical system that had dominated European healthcare for centuries didn't end with a dramatic collapse or a decisive reform movement. Instead, it faded away gradually, like a patient slowly recovering from a long illness, until people looked around one day and realized that medicine had become something fundamentally different from what it had been before the plague. The specific events that marked this transformation were often mundane administrative changes rather than dramatic medical breakthroughs. Cities began requiring medical practitioners to demonstrate actual competence rather than just academic credentials. University medical schools started including practical training alongside theoretical study. Guild regulations began focusing on patient outcomes rather than just professional procedures. One of the final major players in this transition was Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, who commissioned a comprehensive review of medical education in the 1450s. Nicholas wasn't a physician himself, but he had observed the medical chaos of the post-plague period and concluded that some form of organized reform was necessary. His commission included both traditional university physicians and the empirical practitioners who had emerged during the plague years. The commission's report was a masterpiece of diplomatic compromise that managed to validate both traditional medical learning and the observational methods that had developed during the crisis. It recommended that medical education should include both classical texts and practical experience, that treatments should be evaluated based on outcomes as well as theoretical soundness, and that different types of medical practitioners should be allowed to specialize in areas where they had demonstrated competence. The last attempts to preserve the old system came from die-hard traditionalists who insisted that abandoning classical medical authorities would lead to the triumph of ignorance over learning. Some university physicians published treatises arguing that the empirical methods that had emerged during the plague were fundamentally unscientific and that only education in classical texts could produce true medical knowledge. These final defenders of traditional medicine weren't entirely wrong. The empirical approaches that had developed during the plague years were often unsystematic and based on limited observations. But their alternative was a return to medical practices that had demonstrably failed during the greatest medical crisis in European history, which wasn't exactly a compelling argument. The dramatic final moments, such as they were, involved more symbolic gestures than actual conflicts. The University of Padua officially revised its medical curriculum in 1465 to include mandatory practical training alongside theoretical study. The University of Paris followed suit in 1472. Other medical schools gradually adopted similar reforms, not because they were convinced of the superiority of new methods, but because students were increasingly reluctant to enroll in programs that ignored practical medical skills. The gradual decline was probably more historically significant than any dramatic ending would have been. Medieval medicine didn't die. It evolved into something that retained some of its theoretical framework while incorporating the practical lessons learned during the plague years. This evolutionary approach allowed for continuity and gradual improvement rather than the kind of revolutionary disruption that might have created new problems while solving old ones. By 1500, the medical system that emerged looked like a hybrid of traditional and empirical approaches. Physicians still studied classical texts, but they also learned anatomy through dissection. They still considered theoretical knowledge important, but they also emphasized practical experience. They still charged fees for medical services, but they were more likely to be judged by their results rather than just their credentials. The medieval medical system ended not because it was overthrown by superior alternatives, but because it became impossible to maintain in the face of demographic, economic, and intellectual changes that made its continuation unsustainable. The plague had killed so many traditional physicians and disrupted so many institutions that rebuilding the old system would have required more resources and authority than anyone possessed. Internal problems were fundamental and had been accumulating for decades before the plague exposed them. Medieval medicine had become increasingly disconnected from practical healing, more focused on maintaining professional status than improving patient outcomes, and more committed to preserving ancient knowledge than developing new understanding. The plague didn't create these problems, it just made them impossible to ignore. External pressures included economic changes that made expensive medical care less affordable for most people, political changes that reduced the authority of traditional institutions, and cultural changes that made people more skeptical of expertise that wasn't backed by results. The rise of printing also meant that medical knowledge was becoming more widely available, reducing the monopoly that university physicians had enjoyed over medical information. The role of individuals versus historical forces in ending medieval medicine was complex. Specific people like Giovanni da Prato and Sister Catherine played important roles in demonstrating alternative approaches, but the broader transformation was driven by social and economic forces that would have operated regardless of individual actions. The plague created conditions that made medical reform inevitable, though the specific form that reform took was influenced by individual innovators. That what could have been done differently is an interesting counterfactual question. If medieval physicians had been more willing to adapt their methods based on observation during the plague years, the transition might have been smoother and less disruptive. If universities had reformed medical education earlier, they might have maintained more authority during the transformation. If political authorities had intervened more actively to regulate medical practice, the period of medical anarchy might have been shorter. But asking what could have been done differently assumes that the people involved had options that they probably didn't actually have. Medieval physicians were constrained by their training, their professional obligations, and their intellectual framework in ways that made adaptation extremely difficult. Universities were institutions designed to preserve and transmit existing knowledge rather than to generate new knowledge. Political authorities were dealing with the collapse of multiple systems simultaneously and had limited capacity to manage medical reform while addressing economic, social, and political crises. The question of inevitability versus contingency is particularly interesting in this case. Some form of medical reform was probably inevitable given the scale of institutional failure during the plague years. But the specific character of that reform, the emphasis on empirical observation, the inclusion of diverse practitioners, the gradual rather than revolutionary pace of change, was contingent on specific circumstances and individual decisions. The most important factor in the end of medieval medicine was probably the simple passage of time. The people who had been trained in the old system gradually died or retired, while new practitioners who had learned their skills during the plague years became more numerous and influential. Institutional change often happens generationally, rather than through dramatic reforms, and the transformation of medieval medicine followed this pattern. The immediate aftermath of medieval medicine's transformation was like watching a construction site, where the old building had been demolished. But the new one wasn't quite finished yet. What emerged in the late 15th and early 16th centuries was a medical system that was more practical and evidence-based than its predecessor, but also more chaotic and less standardized than what would eventually develop. Who stepped into the institutional vacuum left by the collapse of traditional medical authority was a diverse group that reflected the fragmented nature of post-plague medical practice. Reformed universities began producing physicians who had both classical education and practical training. Guild systems expanded to include barber surgeons and other manual practitioners as legitimate medical professionals. Religious institutions continued to provide medical care, but with less emphasis on miraculous cures and more focus on practical nursing care. The short-term consequences included both improvements and new problems. Medical care became more affordable and accessible as the monopoly of university physicians was broken. Treatment outcomes improved as harmful practices like excessive bloodletting became less common. But medical knowledge also became more fragmented and inconsistent as different practitioners developed different approaches without effective coordination. Contemporary reactions to this transformation were mixed and often depended on people's personal experiences with medical care. Patients who had been bankrupted by expensive, ineffective treatments generally welcomed the changes. Families who had watched loved ones die despite receiving the best traditional medical care available were relieved that medicine was becoming more honest about its limitations. But there was also nostalgia for the certainty and authority of the old system, even among people who recognized its failures. Medieval medicine might have been ineffective, but it had provided clear answers and confident predictions in ways that the new empirical approaches did not. Some people preferred confident incompetence to honest uncertainty, which says something important about human psychology and the social functions of medical authority. Attempts at revival or continuation of traditional approaches persisted in various forms. Some universities tried to maintain classical medical education while adding practical components. Certain regions attempted to restore the exclusive authority of university physicians. A few practitioners continued to promote treatments based purely on ancient authorities rather than empirical observation. These revival attempts generally failed, not because they were actively suppressed, but because they couldn't compete effectively with approaches that produce better results at lower costs. The market for medical services had been fundamentally changed by the plague experience, and patients were no longer willing to pay premium prices for treatments that demonstrably didn't work. The most lasting immediate legacy was probably the establishment of the principle that medical treatments should be judged by their outcomes rather than their theoretical foundations or the credentials of the people administering them. This principle would take centuries to be fully implemented, but its establishment during the post-plague period represented a fundamental shift in how people thought about medical authority and expertise. The legacy of being a doctor during the Black Death shaped medical development in ways that rippled through centuries, like dropping a boulder into a pond and watching the waves reach shores you never expected. The specific influences were both direct and indirect, transforming not just how medicine was practiced, but how societies thought about expertise, authority, and the relationship between knowledge and results. Most directly, the plague experience established empirical observation as a legitimate source of medical knowledge alongside classical authorities. This wasn't immediately revolutionary. It took centuries for empirical methods to fully replace authority-based medicine, but the precedent was crucial. Post-plague physicians who documented what actually worked and what didn't provided a model that would eventually evolve into clinical research and evidence-based medicine. The transformation also influenced medical education in ways that persisted long after the specific crisis had passed. The integration of practical training with theoretical study which began as an emergency response to medical system collapse, became the standard model for medical education. Modern medical schools still require both classroom learning and clinical experience, a combination that traces back to the reforms forced by plague-era medical failures. How later generations viewed the Black Death medical experience reveals interesting patterns of historical memory and professional mythology. Renaissance physicians generally portrayed the plague period as a time of medical darkness that had been overcome by the revival of classical learning and the development of more scientific approaches. This narrative was partly true, but also served to establish Renaissance medicine as superior to its medieval predecessor. Enlightenment. Medical reformers used the Black Death period as an example of what happened when medicine was based on authority rather than reason and observation. They were more critical of medieval medical practices than Renaissance physicians had been, but they also gave more credit to the empirical innovations that had emerged during the plague years, the myths versus realities that developed around this period are particularly fascinating. The popular image of plague doctors as sinister figures in bird masks became a symbol of medical incompetence and the dangers of following authority blindly. This wasn't entirely unfair, but it oversimplified a complex period of medical transition and ignored the genuine attempts at reform that had emerged from the crisis. One persistent myth was that medieval medicine was uniformly terrible, and that progress only began with the Renaissance. In reality, the post-plague period saw significant improvements in surgical techniques, the development of more systematic approaches to medical observation, and the beginning of anatomical studies that would later contribute to Renaissance medical advances. Why the Black Death medical experience remained important to later medical development had to do with its role as a foundational crisis that demonstrated both the importance of medical effectiveness and the dangers of institutional complacency. Every subsequent medical crisis, cholera outbreaks, influenza pandemics, the development of modern surgery was interpreted partly through the lens of the plague experience. The period also remained important because it represented one of the few times in history when medical authority had collapsed so completely that alternative approaches could emerge and be tested. Most medical reforms happen within existing institutional frameworks, but the plague created conditions where entirely new approaches could develop without having to compete directly with established authorities. Today, we can see echoes of the Black Death medical experience in contemporary healthcare crises that reveal uncomfortable similarities in how institutions respond to challenges that exceed their capabilities. The COVID-19 pandemic in particular demonstrated patterns that would have been familiar to anyone who lived through the medieval plague years. The tension between institutional authority and emerging evidence, the proliferation of competing treatments and theories, and the public's struggle to evaluate medical claims when experts disagree. The specific parallels are sometimes uncanny. Modern healthcare systems initially responded to COVID with confidence in existing protocols and established authorities. Much like medieval physicians initially tried to treat plague with standard bloodletting and humor balancing techniques. When those approaches proved inadequate, both systems went through periods of rapid experimentation with treatments that ranged from promising to bizarre to actively harmful. The role of alternative medicine during COVID mirrors the rise of folk healers and non-traditional practitioners during the Black Death. When people lose confidence in mainstream medical institutions, they often turn to alternatives that promise certainty and simple solutions. The medieval turn to herbalists and religious healers finds its modern equivalent in the popularity of unproven treatments promoted by non-medical authorities. Social media has created a modern equivalent of the medieval proliferation of competing medical theories. Just as post-plague Europe saw the emergence of dozens of different healing traditions with no effective way to evaluate their relative merits, the internet age has created an environment where medical misinformation can spread faster than accurate information, and where credentials matter less than the ability to attract followers. The pattern of institutional authority being challenged by empirical observation also repeats in modern contexts. The development of evidence-based medicine in the late 20th century represented a systematic attempt to prioritize research results over traditional medical authority, much like post-plague physicians tried to prioritize observed outcomes over classical texts. What hasn't changed about human nature is the tendency to seek certainty and authority during medical crises, even when that certainty is false and the authority is incompetent. Medieval people paid premium prices for plague doctors who wore impressive costumes and promised miracle cures. Modern people pay premium prices for alternative treatments that promise to cure cancer with dietary supplements or energy healing. The psychology of medical authority also remains consistent across centuries. People want to believe that someone, somewhere, understands what's happening and knows how to fix it. When mainstream medicine admits uncertainty or limitations, people often turn to alternatives that offer more confident predictions, even when those predictions are less reliable. Similar patterns in different contexts can be seen in the history of other medical crises. The cholera outbreaks of the 19th century produced the same kinds of institutional failures and alternative medicine booms that characterized the plague years. The early AIDS epidemic saw similar tensions between established medical authorities and patient advocacy groups, pushing for faster development of new treatments. The lessons for contemporary issues are both encouraging and sobering. The encouraging lesson is that medical systems can reform and improve in response to crisis, and that empirical observation can eventually triumph over institutional inertia. The sobering lesson is that this process is usually slow, often chaotic, and frequently involves significant harm to patients while institutions figure out what actually works. Modern healthcare reformers face challenges that are structurally similar to those faced by post-plague medical innovators. How do you change systems that are deeply invested in existing practices? How do you evaluate new approaches when the evidence is incomplete? How do you maintain public confidence in medical institutions while acknowledging their limitations? These questions don't have easy answers now any more than they did in the 14th century. Even now, the experience of being a doctor during the Black Death continues to influence modern medicine in ways that are both obvious and subtle. Academic study of this period has contributed to our understanding of how medical systems respond to crisis and how institutional change happens in healthcare. Medical historians use the Black Death experience as a case study in the importance of empirical observation and the dangers of authority-based medicine. Medical schools teach about this period as an example of how professional confidence can mask professional incompetence, and how systems that look impressive can be fundamentally dysfunctional. Popular culture has embraced the image of the plague doctor as a symbol of both medical authority and medical failure. The bird-masked figure appears in everything from video games to fashion to protest imagery, usually representing the idea that impressive appearances can hide fundamental incompetence. This cultural symbolism keeps the lessons of plague-era medicine alive in public consciousness. Political discourse often references the Black Death medical experience when discussing healthcare reform, usually as an example of what happens when medical systems prioritize institutional interests over patient outcomes. Both critics and defenders of modern healthcare use plague-era examples to support their arguments about the need for reform or the dangers of abandoning established practices. Social movements, particularly those focused on patient rights and medical transparency, often invoke the plague period as an example of what can happen when patients are excluded from medical decision-making and when treatments are evaluated based on authority rather than evidence. The continuing influence is what's also visible in ongoing debates about medical regulation and professional licensing. The question of how to balance the need for professional standards with the need for innovation and flexibility remains as relevant today as it was in the post-plague period. Why people still care about this historical period has to do with its relevance to contemporary medical and social issues. The Black Death medical experience represents a concentrated example of institutional failure and reform that provides lessons for how societies can respond to existential threats. In an era of rapid medical advancement and ongoing healthcare crises, these lessons remain remarkably applicable. Before we close our journey through the medical nightmare that was being a doctor during the Black Death, we need to talk about the treatments themselves, the actual, documented medical procedures that trained physicians prescribed for plague victims. Because if you thought the general incompetence we've discussed was bad, wait until you hear about the specific remedies that medieval doctors came up with when faced with the greatest medical crisis in human history. These weren't just ineffective treatments. These were medical interventions so bizarre, so counterproductive, and so expensive that they make modern alternative medicine look scientifically rigorous by comparison. We're talking about medical procedures that were like trying to perform brain surgery using a spoon, a prayer book, and absolute confidence that you knew what you were doing. What makes these treatments particularly fascinating is that they weren't developed by random charlatans or desperate amateurs. These were the official medical responses created by the most educated physicians in Europe, men who had spent years studying at prestigious universities and who had access to the most complete medical libraries of their time. They represented the absolute pinnacle of medieval medical knowledge applied to the greatest medical challenge in European history. The result was a collection of treatments that read like a collaboration between a medieval pharmacist, an astrologer, and someone who had perhaps suffered a recent head injury. These remedies combined the worst aspects of ancient medical theory with the kind of creative desperation that emerges when experts realize they have no idea what they're doing, but are too professionally invested to admit it. Understanding these specific treatments helps us grasp not just how medieval medicine failed, but how spectacularly and expensively it failed. These weren't simple mistakes or minor oversights. These were systematic approaches to making sick people worse while charging them premium prices for the privilege. Let's start with Theriac, which was basically the medieval equivalent of a miracle cure that cost more than a house and was about as effective as trying to cure cancer by eating gold coins. Theriac was supposedly an antidote to all poisons and diseases, which should have been the first red flag, because any medicine that claims to cure everything usually cures nothing. The recipe for Theriac was like a shopping list written by someone who had never heard of practical economics or basic chemistry. It contained over 60 ingredients, including viper's flesh, opium, cinnamon, myrrh, frankincense, and various other substances that had to be imported from the far corners of the known world. Making Theriac was like trying to cook a meal that required ingredients from 4 different continents and the approval of 3 different gods. The process of making Theriac was so complex and expensive that it became a public spectacle in major cities. Venice held annual Theriac-making ceremonies that drew crowds of spectators who came to watch pharmacists create what was essentially the world's most expensive placebo. The whole process took months and involved careful timing based on astrological calculations, because medieval medicine never met a superstition it couldn't incorporate into a medical procedure. But here's where Theriac gets really ridiculous. The main ingredient was supposed to be flesh from vipers that had been fed on specific herbs and killed according to precise rituals. Medieval pharmacists would actually stage elaborate viper killing ceremonies, complete with special knives and ceremonial procedures, as if the snake's cause of death would somehow affect the medicine's potency. It was like believing that the effectiveness of aspirin depended on whether the willow tree had been cut down by someone wearing the right color hat. The cost of genuine theriac was astronomical. A single dose could cost more than a skilled craftsman earned in a year. This led to a thriving market in fake theriac, which created the bizarre situation where people were paying premium prices for counterfeit versions of a medicine that didn't work anyway. It was like having a black market in fake unicorn tears. During the plague, desperate families would bankrupt themselves buying theriac for dying relatives, convinced that if they could just afford the real thing, their loved ones would be saved. Physicians prescribed it with absolute confidence, despite the fact that plague patients who received theriac died at exactly the same rate as those who didn't. But since theriac was so expensive and elaborate to make, people assumed it must be effective. After all, why would something so costly and complicated exist if it didn't work? The theriac industry became so lucrative that entire guilds developed around its production and sale. Cities competed to have the most prestigious theriac makers, and physicians built their reputations partly on their ability to prescribe the highest quality versions. It was a perfect example of how medieval medicine could turn complete ineffectiveness into a luxury commodity. If theriac was medieval medicine's most expensive mistake, mercury treatments were its most toxic. Medieval physicians had somehow convinced themselves that mercury, a substance that's literally poisonous to human beings, was a miracle cure that could treat everything from plague to depression to what they called melancholy of the spleen, which wasn't even a real condition. The logic behind mercury treatments was typical medieval medical reasoning, since mercury was a liquid metal that moved in interesting ways. Physicians concluded that it must have special properties that could restore the balance of humors in the human body. It was like deciding that because something looks cool, it must be medically beneficial. By this logic, lava lamps would be considered advanced medical equipment. Mercury was administered in ways that would make a modern toxicologist weep with despair. Patients were given mercury to drink. Mercury was applied to their skin as ointments, and mercury vapor was used in fumigation treatments, where sick people were essentially hotboxed with toxic metal fumes. Some physicians even prescribed mercury baths, where patients would soak in water that had been mixed with liquid mercury, which was basically like taking a relaxing swim in industrial waste. The side effects of mercury poisoning were well documented by medieval physicians, but instead of recognizing these as signs that mercury might not be an ideal medicine, doctors interpreted them as evidence that the treatment was working. When patients developed tremors, lost their teeth, or experienced cognitive problems, physicians explained that these were signs that the mercury was driving disease out of the body. It was like interpreting food poisoning as evidence that your meal was particularly nutritious. During the plague, mercury treatments became even more popular because physicians reasoned that if a little mercury was good, a lot of mercury must be better. Plague victims were subjected to intensive mercury therapy that often killed them faster than the disease itself. Some patients died from mercury poisoning before the plague had a chance to run its course, which created the bizarre situation where the cure was more efficient than the disease. The mercury industry thrived during the plague years, with merchants importing the toxic metal from mines in Spain and Slovenia to meet the demand from physicians who were convinced they were providing cutting-edge medical care. Cities developed specialized mercury markets, and the quality of mercury became a point of professional pride among physicians. It was like having a luxury market for poison, complete with premium brands and quality certifications. But if we're talking about ridiculous medieval medical treatments, we have to spend some time on bloodletting, which was medieval medicine's answer to literally every health problem ever documented. Got a fever? Let's drain some blood. Feeling sad? Clearly, you have too much blood. Broke your leg? That blood needs to come out immediately. Bloodletting was like the duct tape of medieval medicine. If it wasn't working, you obviously weren't using enough of it. The theory behind bloodletting was that illness was caused by having too much blood, or blood that was too hot, or blood that was just generally misbehaving inside your body. So naturally, the solution was to drain it out until the patient either recovered or died, which medieval physicians considered a reasonable approach to healthcare. It was like trying to fix a car by removing random parts until it either started working or stopped being a car. Medieval physicians developed bloodletting into an elaborate art form with specialized tools, precise measurements, and detailed charts, showing exactly which veins to cut based on a patient's symptoms, age, and astrological sign. They had special bowls marked with measurements so they could track exactly how much blood they were removing, like following a recipe for human soup. The precision was impressive in a terrifying way. It was like watching someone perform brain surgery with kitchen utensils while following instructions written by someone who had never seen a brain. During the plague, bloodletting became even more aggressive because physicians figured that plague was obviously caused by having way too much blood. So patients needed way more bloodletting. Plague victims who were already weakened by disease were subjected to blood loss that would have been dangerous for healthy people. It was like trying to help a drowning person by removing their life jacket and adding weights to their pockets. The most absurd part of plague era bloodletting was that physicians would sometimes repeat the procedure multiple times on the same patient. If the first bloodletting didn't cure the plague, clearly the patient needed more bloodletting. If the second didn't work, they needed a third. Some patients received daily bloodletting sessions until they were too weak to survive either the treatment or the disease. It was like repeatedly hitting yourself in the head with a hammer while wondering why your headache wasn't getting better. Professional bloodletters developed specialized techniques and tools that turned blood removal into a theatrical performance. They had special knives designed for different types of cuts, ceremonial bowls for catching the blood, and elaborate procedures for determining exactly how much blood to remove. Some bloodletters even offered premium services where they would use gold-plated instruments or perform the procedure while wearing special robes. It was like having a luxury service for something that was essentially medical assault. The bloodletting industry became so lucrative that entire guilds formed around the practice. Cities competed to have the most skilled bloodletters, and physicians built their reputations partly on their bloodletting techniques. It was a perfect example of how medieval medicine could transform harmful incompetence into a respected profession. Perhaps the most ridiculous aspect of medieval plague medicine was the integration of astrology into medical treatment. Because apparently, what sick people really needed was for their health care to be determined by the relative positions of celestial bodies that were millions of miles away and had no conceivable connection to human disease. Medieval physicians genuinely believed that the movement of planets and stars directly influenced human health, which led to treatment protocols that were based more on astronomical calculations than medical observation. They would consult elaborate star charts to determine the optimal timing for bloodletting, the proper dosage of medicines, and even which vein to cut during surgical procedures. It was like having a medical system designed by people who thought that Jupiter's position relative to Mars was more important than whether the patient was actually getting better. The astrological approach to plague treatment created some genuinely bizarre medical procedures. Physicians would delay treating patients until the stars were properly aligned, which sometimes meant letting people suffer while waiting for Mercury to move into the right house or for the moon to enter the correct phase. Some patients died while their doctors were consulting astrological charts to determine the optimal treatment timing, which was like watching someone bleed to death while their doctor calculated mathematical equations that had no connection to stopping bleeding. Different astrological signs supposedly required different treatments. which meant that a patient's birthday was considered more relevant to their medical care than their actual symptoms. Physicians would prescribe completely different remedies for identical plague, symptoms based on whether the patient was born under the sign of Leo or Virgo. It was like having a medical system where your treatment was determined by your horoscope rather than your diagnosis. The most expensive physicians were those who claimed expertise in medical astrology, which required not just medical training, but also extensive study of astronomical calculations and astrological theory. These doctor astrologers charged premium fees for treatments that were supposedly customized based on precise astrological calculations. Wealthy families would pay enormous sums for medical care that was literally based on superstition, convinced that the combination of medical and astrological expertise offered their best chance of survival. During the plague, astrological medicine became even more elaborate as physicians tried to explain why their treatments weren't working. They developed complex theories about how the plague was caused by unfortunate planetary alignments and could only be cured by treatments that were perfectly timed to cosmic events. Some physicians spent more time calculating astrological charts than actually examining patients, which was like having surgeons who were more concerned with the position of the stars than the position of their scalpels. The integration of astrology into medicine created a system where treatment decisions were based on everything except evidence about what actually worked. Physicians would choose medicines, surgical procedures, and treatment timing based on astrological calculations, while ignoring observable evidence about patient outcomes. It was medieval medicine's perfect synthesis of authority-based knowledge and supernatural thinking, resulting in healthcare that was both expensive and completely divorced from reality. Looking back at these specific treatments, it becomes clear that being a doctor during the Black Death wasn't just difficult or primitive. It was actively counterproductive in ways that seemed almost designed to make the plague worse. Medieval physicians had somehow created a medical system where every major treatment was harmful, every expensive remedy was useless, and every confident diagnosis was based on fundamentally wrong assumptions about how disease worked. The real tragedy wasn't just that these treatments didn't work. It was that they often made patients worse while bankrupting their families and giving everyone involved a false sense that something effective was being done. Medieval medicine during the plague was like having a fire department that responded to fires by throwing gasoline on them while charging premium prices for their expertise in fire suppression. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about these ridiculous treatments is that they were developed and administered by people who genuinely believed they were helping. Medieval physicians weren't evil or deliberately harmful. They were working within a system of knowledge that was so fundamentally flawed that good intentions led to disastrous outcomes. They were like people trying to navigate using maps that showed the Earth as flat while insisting that anyone who questioned the maps must be ignorant of proper geography. The lesson from these medieval medical disasters isn't that historical people were stupid or that we should mock their ignorance. The lesson is that institutional systems can become so invested in their own authority that they lose the ability to recognize when their fundamental assumptions are wrong. Medieval medicine failed not because individual doctors were incompetent, but because the entire system was built on foundations that made effective treatment impossible. These treatments remind us that impressive credentials, expensive procedures, and confident authority aren't the same thing as actual effectiveness. Sometimes the most elaborate and prestigious medical care is just elaborate and prestigious ways of making things worse. And sometimes the best medical treatment is the humility to admit that you don't know what you're doing and the wisdom to stop doing things that aren't working. Sound familiar? Looking back across this journey through the nightmare world of medieval medicine during humanity's greatest pandemic, we've seen patterns that are both hilarious and terrifying in there. implications for how societies respond to existential crises. The key themes that emerged from our exploration read like a manual for how to turn a medical emergency into a medical disaster. Prioritize authority over evidence. Maintain institutional confidence despite catastrophic failure. And always remember that impressive credentials can mask complete incompetence. The most important pattern we discovered was how institutions can become so invested in their own authority that they lose sight of their actual purpose. Medieval physicians were so committed to maintaining their professional status and following established procedures that they continued using treatments that obviously didn't work, even when those treatments seemed to be making patients worse. It was like watching people insist on using a broken GPS that kept directing them into walls while refusing to admit that maybe they should try a different navigation system. Our most surprising discovery was probably how the worst medical crisis in European history accidentally became the catalyst for the beginning of evidence-based medicine. The complete failure of traditional medical approaches during the plague forced some practitioners to start paying attention to what actually worked, rather than what ancient authorities said should work. It was medical progress through institutional collapse, not the most efficient way to advance human knowledge, but apparently sometimes the only way. The most important takeaway from this historical journey is that expertise without effectiveness is just expensive theater. Medieval medicine looked impressive, involved years of specialized education, and was practiced by people with impressive credentials who could quote ancient authorities extensively. But when it came to actually helping sick people, it was often worse than doing nothing. The lesson isn't that expertise is worthless, but that real expertise has to be measured by results rather than credentials. How our understanding has evolved throughout this exploration reveals the complexity of institutional change and the fierce difficulty of reforming systems that are failing. We started with the assumption that medieval medicine was simply ignorant and backward, but we discovered that the real problem was structural, a system that rewarded theoretical knowledge over practical results, and that made it professionally dangerous to question established authorities, even when those authorities were demonstrably wrong. The evolution of medical practice during and after the plague wasn't a simple story of progress, triumphing over ignorance. It was a messy, chaotic process where better approaches emerged gradually from the ruins of institutional failure, often developed by people who were considered marginal or unqualified by traditional standards. Real reform happened despite official institutions rather than because of them, which is both encouraging and sobering for anyone interested in how complex systems change. Let me leave you with one final story that encapsulates everything we've learned about being a doctor during the Black Death, because sometimes the best way to understand a historical period is through the experience of a single person who lived through its contradictions and absurdities. Master Pietro Siena was a university-trained physician who began his career in 1347, just as the plague was reaching Italy. Pietro had spent 6 years studying medicine at the University of Bologna, where he had memorized extensive passages from Galen and Hippocrates, learned to diagnose diseases by examining urine, and mastered the complex art of bloodletting according to astrological calculations. He was, by every measure available at the time, an excellent physician who was fully prepared to practice medieval medicine. When the plague hit Siena in 1348, Pietro threw himself into treating victims with all the skill and knowledge at his disposal. He carefully examined each patient's urine, consulted astrological charts to determine the optimal timing for bloodletting, and prescribed elaborate combinations of expensive medicines designed to restore the balance of humors in their bodies. He worked tirelessly, often seeing dozens of patients per day, and charged fees that reflected both his extensive education and the intensity of his efforts. The problem was that his patients kept dying anyway. Not just most of them, virtually all of them. Pietro's mortality rate was so high that people began to suspect he was somehow making the plague worse rather than better. Families started hiding sick relatives rather than bringing them for treatment. And Pietro found himself with fewer patients, despite the city being overrun with plague victims. The turning point came when Pietro's own wife contracted the plague. Faced with treating someone he loved rather than anonymous patients, Pietro found himself questioning every aspect of his medical training. Should he really drain blood from someone who was already weakened by disease? Did expensive medicines actually help, or were they just a way to make families feel like they were doing something? Were the treatments making people worse? In desperation, Pietro decided to treat his wife with nothing but rest, clean water, and basic comfort care. No bloodletting, no mercury, no elaborate medicines, just supportive care while her body tried to fight off the disease. His wife survived, which was remarkable enough to get Pietro's attention. But what really shook him was the realization that she had recovered despite receiving none of the treatments that he had been taught were essential for treating serious illness. This experience didn't immediately transform Pietro into a medical revolutionary. Institutional habits die hard, and he had spent 6 years learning to think like a medieval physician. But it started him down a path of questioning and observation that would eventually make him one of the pioneering figures in post-plague medical reform. Pietro began keeping careful records of which treatments seemed to help and which seemed to harm. He started experimenting with less aggressive approaches. He began consulting with folk healers and herbalists whose methods he had previously dismissed as ignorant superstition. Most importantly, he started admitting to patients and their families when he didn't know what to do, which was revolutionary in a profession that had been built on projecting confidence even in the face of complete ignorance. By the time Pietro retired in the 1370s, he was practicing medicine that would have been unrecognizable to his former professors. His story shows us how individual practitioners could evolve and adapt even within systems that resisted change, and how personal experience could sometimes overcome even the most thorough professional indoctrination. As we reach the end of tonight's journey through the bizarre and tragic world of medieval medicine during humanity's greatest pandemic, it's worth remembering that the doctors and patients we've encountered weren't characters in a historical drama. They were real, people trying to survive and help others survive an unprecedented crisis with the tools and knowledge available to them. Their failures weren't due to lack of caring or effort, but to the limitations of their time and the institutional structures that shaped their understanding of disease and healing. Their occasional successes came not from superior wisdom, but from the kind of practical experimentation and honest observation that emerges when existing systems fail so completely that people have no choice but to try something different. Story of being a doctor during the Black Death is ultimately a story about how humans respond to crisis, sometimes with wisdom, sometimes with stubborn adherence to failing systems, but always with the hope that somehow, somewhere, there might be a way to help people suffer less and live better. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most challenging medical periods. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember that even our worst medical failures can teach us something about how to do better.